happy I am to be back at Duke. I've known Duke an awfully long time. It's one of those places that for most of my career, most of my colleagues have somehow come through Duke. In fact, the first academic book I ever bought was a book called The Tabernacle Menorah when I was in high school. That's pretty sick. That stayed with me all the way through my new book on the menorah. So that was a start. Then there was the archaeologist who sort of took me under his wing as I was a beginning doctoral student when I schlepped a big piece of basalt in the back of my car in Los Angeles when Eric came to visit. And I said, "Do you know what this thing is?" Because it belonged to a collector in Los Angeles, and I wasn't sure if it was real or not, or even what to do with it. And that was the beginning of that friendship and all sorts of wonderful things. Then I started reading about this crazy, what I now think of as postmodern interpretation of the Dura Europa synagogue that came out that in Jerusalem caused a storm when I was a graduate student because it was so outlandish, and that was Annabelle Wharton, right? Then the most important piece was when I ran away from dealing with things visual and ran away from art history because I got really tired of people telling me that the stuff I study doesn't matter and that it's worthless and that it's uninteresting and that why aren't you really doing Talmud, which I do, but why are you bothering with all that visual stuff? And then I realized that I wasn't the only one, that the folks in Indian art and the people in Byzantine were suffering from the same malady, and that somebody down at Duke had written an article explaining how this odd Western formation of the artless Jew came together, and that was Calm and Bland. Now, this process continued as I made friends with all of these people through the years and walked up to Kalman at a conference at the Association for Jewish Studies like he was a savior, right? This guy had explained to me what I knew and that I had lived, but I couldn't put into words why the material I studied had been so undervalued or, as I found out later on, oddly interpreted, which went to the next step because we didn't have a language for talking about stuff that wasn't Rembrandt, right? Objects that were not the top one in the Vatican Museum, but number 15, but happened to be Jewish, right? We just didn't have a language for talking about that until I heard about this thing called visual culture, and that's David Morgan, who I just met. But, you know, really, this is an amazing assemblage of experiences in my life, and then continues to Laura, of course, but we won't even get to that. That's the newest, right? But it's only, what, a decade and a half old. The odd assembly at Duke University of people who were willing to break the rules and talk about Jews who had bodies and rocks and think about culture in a different way down here, right? Not up in the Northeast Corridor where that was just not a possibility, right? So I keep coming back in and out of this community, and it's been that way since the late 80s, which is an astonishing thing to be able to say. So I want to thank you for bringing me back. As you can see, I've dedicated these short remarks to my friend Kalman. I was in Munster at a conference not too long ago, and he was supposed to be there too, and I was the one who had to tell everyone that he wasn't with us and talk about him for a little while. And I told the story that I just told, Kalman Bland's generosity, Kalman Bland's kindness, and his inquisitiveness, right? All based in real-life philology, which for me is always the bedrock of the beginning of scholarship. And that's something that was built here, that was allowed to become strange here, and has transformed scholarship, which is an amazing thing to be able to say. So I miss Kalman, and I know many people here do as well. Yehi Zichro Baruch, may his memory be a blessing. Now, I'm going to talk about color. Now, color is one of those subjects that, like emotions, like other senses, just was off the table except for folks who dealt with connoisseurship, right? The Bernard Berensons of the world. No one thought much about it until 20, 30 years ago, when it exploded as a subject. Can we turn down the lights? The colors could wash out without the darkness. And it began with a group in Germany yeah, perfect. A group in Germany in Munich, all museum curators. Now, museum curators have the great advantage over you and me. They touch stuff, right? And they found colors on their rocks. And they didn't know what to do with it because there was no theorizing that would make sense of these colors on their rocks. In fact, when I gave this lecture for the first time almost a decade ago at an Israeli university, one of the archaeologists said to me, I found a rock with color on it. I didn't know what it was, so I wiped it off. Right? It's not that he was being negative. He just didn't know what it was, because after all, we work with black and white photographs. We don't see the object day in, day out, unless we really want to. And by not touching them and seeing them, which is a very tactile piece of my work, we miss stuff, right? And so this group in Germany put out an exhibition called Bunte Götter, or when it came to Boston, Gods in Color, and they started looking for evidence of color and then colorizing. Remember when we took Art History 1, they told us these archaic people were so cute because they had little mouths? Right? That's what Greek archaic is. Well, it's not such a big deal once she's painted. The image changes, the perception changes, the relationship changes, which shouldn't be surprising, except that it is. Please. Thanks. Okay. So I first found these people in Istanbul with this, which is one of the many sarcophagi of Alexander the Great, where they found bits of color, and this German team created this. I thought, oh my God, I've been thinking about that. Because rabbinic sources often talk about color in different ways. And so, the difference between nighttime and daytime is the difference between techelet v'charti, the difference between something that's sort of bluish and something that's sort of greenish, but I'm not sure exactly what that text means at all. But color as a determinant for how culture works, I've been thinking about, and here these people were 5 steps ahead of me or more. I thought, that's interesting, and I let it sit. What I found out is that Western culture has a malady. I know that because I live in New York City, where everyone has a gray suit, a brown suit, and a black suit, and maybe a navy suit. But no one has a bright green suit except for St. Patrick's Day. Right? No one has a car that's bright blue, except me. I named it Blueberry. Everyone has a gray car, a white car, right? A brown car, very subdued, because those are serious colors, right? As opposed to unserious colors. Take the Metro North into work one day and you'll see rows of people in boring colors all dressed the same way, and those are serious people. I was in a cab once with a Sikh who was wearing a black turban. I said, why do you have we started talking. He said, why do you have a black turban? I said, did your father wear a black turban? No. What color turban does your father wear? He said, oh, a white one, or an orange one, or a yellow one. And I said, so why do you wear a black one? He said, well, in America, they don't take you seriously in bright colors, so I dress like the rabbis and the priest, right? Now, let me tell you, the rabbis didn't dress like that until they got to America because of this odd notion, this odd modern notion of whiteness. And, of course, Tel Aviv, the white city, the ultimate modern place or modernist place, right? And so color was washed out of the system with black and white becoming symbols, deeply embedded symbols of purity. And so why would anybody wear a bright color? You're a red shirt, right? You're clearly not a serious person because it's not as white as Eviatar's shirt. It's just how it is, right? Next one. Now, a change happened in the early 60s. Now, many people remember this moment. Those of you who grew up in Israel remember it in the 80s, right? When color television came to town. And how did they announce color television? You'll remember, the world is a carousel of color, right? And they flash it. Wonderful, wonderful color, when we all had black and white TVs. Right? It's a way of getting us to make the transition. A whole generation of people exactly in my age group, 40 years later, started asking questions about black and white. Now, I point out that studies have shown that in the 1950s, most people dreamt in black and white when they asked them about their dreams. A decade later, they're dreaming in color. In other words, the media that we're using really does affect how we see and imagine the world. And so a whole generation began thinking about this color thing without having a language to do it, including some curators in Germany who began thinking about Roman art in a different way. When I was an intern in the Department of Indian Art at the LA County Museum of Art, Professor Pratapaditya Paul constantly reminded me that those white statues were painted except someone cleaned them for sale. For sale. Next, please. Now, for Jews, this is an even worse problem. Because, as you know, Jews don't do art. Jews can't do art. It's a genetic programming issue. Sort of like a giraffe gets a long neck, Jews do the second commandment. That's the end of their visual capacity. Right? And so, for the same reason to which is to be added a defective sense of color, and it goes through the 6 plays well, prevented any development of painting. It's not simple. It's genetic. Jews do black and white. Now, I point out that if you actually read Delitzsch's article, he says that Jews do color. And how do you know that? Because rabbis are so good at differentiating the colors of menstrual blood. How could they not be good at color? In other words, it says just the opposite of what this article by Benziger is claiming. But that doesn't take anything away. Why confuse the issue with other opinions? Jews don't do color. Next one. It gets even worse after World War II when everything Eastern European is black and white. The photographs of Eastern Europe, remember, Eastern Europe is black and white, America's color. We've gone from Kansas to Oz. And so there's a huge break. Anyone who's seen those World War II in color films, for me at least, they're startling. Hitler's not supposed to be color, right? Auschwitz is not supposed to be color. United States in 1960 is supposed to be color. It makes it amazingly close rather than distant when it goes from black and white to color. This assumption about Jewish culture that Sam Gruber has pointed out is not just about Jews. It's about everyone. But this is an extreme case, and that's why I pointed out. Because so much was destroyed in the Holocaust, and because most of what was documented is known only in black and white images, we have inherited a skewed view of Jewish aesthetics. The veil of memory, inevitably somber and dark because of the tragedy of the Holocaust, has dimmed much of the exuberant color of pre-Holocaust Jewish life, to the point that ultra-Orthodox rabbis wear black today. They didn't necessarily before the war. Next, please. Which leads me to this rock. This menorah was discovered by this fellow, Nachum Shlush, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee in 1921. It's a major event in the history of Zionism, the first Zionist excavation. And he writes how, after they dug this very nice piece of marble, next one please, out of the water, out of the ground, they took it down to the Sea of Galilee, 100 yards away or so, and they washed it off. That does not serve my needs well, that they washed it off, because chances are there were molecules of color embedded in the limestone that in years of polishing at the Bezalel National Museum and the Israel Museum are long gone. Okay? But what we're looking at is a large piece of limestone, which was carved in bas-relief, with a menorah, with flowers, with pomegranates, right? With holes on the top to hold the lamps, glass lamps, that was lit in a synagogue in the 5th century. My experiment was as follows. I wonder if it was really black and white. I wonder if it was gray like this. So I started to play. Can I have the next one? Where do I play with? Well, I took this mosaic that has lots of different colors, right? It has greens and browns and whites and all different colors as the base object. So if this ancient synagogue from Beit Shean had many colors, maybe that stone did too. Next, please. So, for example, these stones from Tzoar, this inscription from the Beit Shean Valley. By the way, there's an inscription on this inscription that says, I so-and-so made this. It's sort of cute. In red ochre. Maybe the stone, I wondered, was colored to look like that. No one had paid any attention to the colors in any of these places. If you go into the standard guidebooks on ancient synagogues, none of them say, except for Dora Ropos, by the way, they found paint there. None of them. They're all gray and white and shiny and beautiful and modern. And modern is important because those wonderful white stones at Capernaum look beautifully like the beautiful stones in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. In other words, there was a correspondence that people immediately saw and assumed, but it wasn't the case. The next one. So I took a little bit of crayon and I called it Doodle Number 1. Doodle Number 1 created the backdrop for the relief. Okay. Well, over time, this went more and more crazy. Next one. Then I did the opposite and decorated the facade, the face up above, with the same kind of flower pattern. Now, I don't know if my stone looked anything like this in antiquity, but there's one thing I can tell you for sure: it wasn't white, because the stone does not show up without the addition of pigment. Next one. All right, these are other stones from Tzoar at the bottom of the Dead Sea, except they used green and red. Christian stones, a little bit of white. So you know what happened next. Next one. I went further. Right? I don't know if it looked like this, but it wasn't white. Next one. All right, let's keep going. Right? Got a little yellow out of this one. Next one. That one went a little far, maybe. One more. Keep going. What I realized at a certain point was that I was not alone. A poet from the 6th century, I did poets because it's Laura. A poet from the 6th century named Yanai, right? Who Laura knows just a little bit about, right? For my money, the most beautiful, elegant, and spectacular Jewish poet of antiquity. Probably yours too. Along with some who came after him, a fellow named Yochanan, thought about colored menorahs too. And this is what he wrote. He said, describing this 7-branch candlestick, he says, Zahav echad haya kamar'eh v'dimyon shish'a zahavim haya nereh. Moses saw in the vision, when God showed him what it should look like, one gold, but there are actually 3. Charutz yarok haya zahav gvi'im adom lekaftorim lavan lefrachim. And it was as follows: there were green calyxes, and there green calyxes, and for the cups, and red for the bulbs, and white for the flowers. So this guy in the 6th century is imagining more or less what I'm imagining without my knowing it. That the menorah was far more colorful than you would expect. That means the prop in the synagogue where the entire liturgical drama took place wasn't this staid white thing or brown thing, but a flickering, moving, colored thing. And the next one? Getting closer. Now, is this anything like what it looked like? Absolutely not. Right? This is Doodle H or something. And when I published it as Doodle A through H. I want no one to think that me, with my whiteout and crayons, right, that I believe that these colors are the correct colors. I don't. But I know it's not white, and so this was the beginning of an experiment, and I was, once again, not the only one. Let's go one more. right? This guy in Germany in the 14th century in the Regensburg Pentateuch had a text much like mine, and he came to much similar decisions. And he's also not the only one. I have 2 or 3 manuscripts like this, where they use similar coloration to what I described. And so the idea of a bright yellow menorah, that's one possibility, but these people came up with much, much more. Now, I asked myself from the start, how in the world would a guy named Yanai understand the color? Is he basing it upon the painted stones of ancient synagogues? That would make a lot of sense. Or did he actually know something about technology? Because these people, my methodological assumption is always that the people I'm studying are smarter than I am. So if he thinks it's colored, how is he reading the technology behind that? So I found a papyrus from Egypt from the 2nd century BCE that tells how to put a patina on gold in various colors. Bingo, right? Or, as a metallurgist pointed out to me, there is no such thing as pure gold. You either have to have copper or silver or platinum in order to harden it, and that leads to different colors. So choose one, but the text makes sense. There's a logic to it, and that changes how we look at the interiors of those places that, right, the Myers discovered. Colorful, bright shadows, movement, and not these bright white edifices that we always thought. And that changes a whole lot, I think. Next step. Keep going. I was asked to join a team to think about this guy. That's Caligula, right? Now, this is Caligula at the Nykolberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen, and they found evidence of color on him. And this is their reconstruction. Now, what's the implication of that? First of all, he's one scary guy. He's not. He's a god. He's standing on the street corner. No wonder ancient rabbis and then church fathers hated these things so much. We now know from the study of robotics something called the Uncanny Valley. The closer a sculpture comes to looking real, it doesn't bother us. But when it gets too real, it's scary. Now, that doesn't change any particular text of Talmudic discussions of idolatry, of Avodah Zarah, but it sets a context that I can now see what they see. What do they imagine when they walk down the street and talk about walking by a sculpture like this? They see somebody who looks like him. And so, next one. I found myself working on this statue of Caligula at the Virginia Museum in Richmond. There's only 2 statues of Caligula. They got rid of the rest of them in antiquity. And wouldn't you know, can I have the next one? They found a drop of purple here, which means he either gets interpreted with a sash of purple or a garment that's wholly purple, right? Now, rabbis knew about such things. They called it a talicha kulat techelet, a garment that's all blue, purple, green. It's not clear because they themselves said that this stuff that they took out of the Menorah shells, this dye that they created, was the color of the waves of the sea, which means anything from green through black. And so, and purple in the middle, right? And so, whether he looked like this or whether he looked like this, he did not look like this. And that changes once again how we deal with this problem. Can I have the next one? So, for example, I just point out, at the Dura Synagogue in the 3rd century, David is also wearing his royal purple sash, like Caligula in the previous image. In other words, to understand the image of David in this case, we really do need a purple Caligula. It gives us a sense of what it means to be Roman royalty, right? Changes the picture. Now, for rabbis, this goes even further because, of course, Mr. Korach has claimed to, according to Midrashic text, a whole cluster of them. When he enters into the public sphere in the time of Moses, comes in a purple or blue toga, talicha kulat techelet. which gives us a very different sense now of what that text is talking about, where the text claims that they're dealing with, well, how much blue and how little blue and how much blue is involved. It doesn't mean that at all. What it's talking about is whose royalty, Moses or Korach. In other words, it opens up a whole conversation once we begin to deal with the color coding of this culture, and on and on and on. And these are just some of my favorite examples. Next. And of course, Justinian. Next, please. Which brings us here, because sitting around the table in Richmond, I looked at the color people and I said, couldn't we do that at the Arch of Titus? And they said, do you have money? I said, maybe. And 3 months later, we found ourselves on scaffolding right about here, looking for color, because no Roman public sculpture of this significance, and particularly that's outside, had ever been tested for color. Now, I just point out before I go on that this is what it may have looked like in antiquity, kinda, and this is what it looked like in the 18th century, and this is the 19th century reconstruction, and most of what you see here is 19th century reconstruction, except for the reliefs on the inside, which were preserved because they made sense for Christians to preserve them. And that's why these particularly large reliefs were preserved. So we brought a team to the Menorah panel, a fellow named Heinrich Piening, who's part of that original German team. And he did something that, when I first started talking about this in 2012, people said, ooh, ah. And when I talk about it now, they say, aha, you scanned it, that's nice. But what we did was scan the object without touching it, and then feed the information retrieved through scanning into a database of color that's preserved in Europe by a whole team from different institutions in relationship to the Nykolberg Glyptothek. And he was able to come out with dabs of yellow. Now, this all looks easy, but you see that yellow tape right there on the sensor? It's because they never had to get so far away from an object when they studied it, so we had to attach a broomstick. Right? Kara will tell you that improvisation is the beginning of research, right? All right, next one, please. And this is what we found. Piening checked every place with a circle. He found yellow paint here, and here, and here. Okay? That's what the yellow paint looks like. It is the most boring image you have ever seen. And my line is usually that for 4 drops of yellow, we made it to the New York Times. Right? Literally 4 drops of yellow that you can't see. Because in the many times that they've cleaned this object, and the last time they did it with the tools used by a dentist to clean your teeth, which let the rust out, right? And let things rust. It was a problem. It turned into a problem. They didn't go into every crack. And Heinrich Piening is an expert at going into the cracks and knowing where to look and finding bits of color. And he found exactly the same yellow paint here that he found here that he found there. Which was revolutionary, because who would ever thought that the thing was painted? We always assumed that it was white. Now the implications, as we'll see in looking at this object, are huge, because the object in white looks different. And not just looks different in that one's colored, one's not. We actually see something different. Next one, please. This is a scan that we made of the entire panel. Let me give you an example. You see how this menorah stands out? It's a much deeper carving than this table of showbread over here. Right? The movement of the panel goes literally into this gate, into Rome. Now, what we're looking at is the Triumphal Parade given to Titus in 71. But Ida Oldenburg at a conference in New York that I arranged last week made the wonderful comment that it's likely that Titus's funeral parade looked very similar, because Augustus's funeral parade looked very similar to his triumph. And maybe they saw this twice, and that's why we find imagery related to his death as well as this parade on the same monument. I thought that was a really clever solution. All of these people, from a distance, look pretty good, don't they? Let me tell you, they're a mess. Every person, there's only one person who's actually left in 3D, that's him. This guy's missing altogether, right? This guy, well, he's a problem in a good day, right? Then there's their legs, right? Look at the mess of the legs. It looks good because we want it to look good, but it really doesn't. And when you see it in color, it's awful, okay? But what I want to stress is that when you see this object in white, the menorah is most prominent, which is why in the Middle Ages they called it the arch of the seven-branch lampstand. If they'd seen it in color, it would have been a much more balanced image with the menorah here and the table here, both in gold. Because now that I know that this is gold, it means this table has to be gold. It means these horns likely have to be silver, because the Bible and Josephus says they're silver. Then, what about their garments? Well, they're white or they're purple, or right? Those are the options. What about their faces? Well, they live in the Mediterranean, so let's assume they look like people from the Mediterranean, right? It means their hair is dark. It means the green on their wreaths is green, right? And so we can more or less begin a process of reconstructing. And since we weren't able to get a permit to go back to Rome, and I got really frustrated, we decided we were going to go forward anyway based upon parallels, and to see what we could see and do what we could do to begin to make sense of what this thing is doing. Okay? Have the next one. And so the first thing we did was begin to put color every place that we could. I want to show you a piece of the video. I want to press play, but then I want to cut through to boop, 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 boop. Okay, this will do. You too far, sorry, there, perfect. Next thing we had to do is think about what we were going to write on the signs and what color we were going to make the signs. And all these decisions were based, of course, upon parallels in Roman art. This is the only 3D head that exists. That's it. The rest fell off. And so what did we do with it? Is it moving? Yeah. We cloned him. And what we didn't do is give each person an individual face. Similarly with the menorah, it was enough to do that. It wasn't hard to do some of it at this stage. The table was more complex. Do we make the bride here? What about the cups on top? Those cups on top are really interesting. We go back to it. Those cups on top are particularly interesting because only one of them is visible. The other one is a hint. And we put the two of them back. Now, those cups are called by the rabbis Bizichei Levana, which I wouldn't quote because it's rabbi text and they're 200 years after this event, more or less, except two cups are mentioned by rabbis being on top of the table, and no one else mentions them. And so this is the earliest evidence of a phenomenon that we hear about from rabbinic literature. It's one of those quiet places where text and artifacts come together and give each other meaning. And so anybody who tells you that absolutely rabbis know nothing about the first century, that's a kind of arbitrariness that came to be associated with Jacob Neusner, but he himself didn't believe it. But that's New Testament people off the hook. It really isn't true. This is a good example of that. Okay? So let's keep going with the color. Okay. Now that's as far as we got. Then, as often happens in university life, I got a call from our president. By the way, I have a donor for you. Here's $1 million. Because I didn't have enough money to do any more, except then we did. And so we began the reconstruction process in earnest. First the tables. The heads we already had, but we, again, didn't give anybody a personality because that would have gone too far. The stuff in their hands, we actually have a bump on this guy's back for the arm to connect, and another one here. This fellow is a fat version of this fellow. Fits, because as you see, it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. In other words, they kept repeating the same folks over and over again until we actually started looking. Even Professor Fanner, who did the original work really the lower criticism on this artifact, missed a whole bunch of that kind of stuff. What do you do with these staffs? Well, right here, there's a little piece of stone sticking up. The rest of them we added. The truth is, some of the Renaissance viewers and early modern viewers who saw more than we did saw things that we didn't. And we were able to build on them. The folks who built the Areopagus put laurels in the hands, here and here. We followed them. What color purple do you use here? Do we use a purple, a blue, right? We guessed. We chose a color. That's what we had to do. On the other hand, these pillows on the shoulders that hold up the lampstand, that's what makes it look so heavy, right? There's another one over here on the table. We made them linen color. The garments are linen, so we needed a slightly different linen, and we played with it. Or similarly, the signs up above, we didn't want to make it the same yellow bronze that you would expect maybe, because it would look too much like the yellow of the menorah. So we darkened the bronze just a little bit. So there's a creative piece to this that's just of necessity what you have to do in such a situation. We had to make some creative decisions. And in our final report, we're going through piece by piece and saying this is what we did. In the earlier version, we put grass here rather than gray stone. What happened? Why did we switch? Because we came to the conclusion that while for painting, for wall painting, the gray stone, the grass makes sense, for public parading, it didn't. Right? And so we went to the gray stone that was typical in Roman cities. If you've been to Pompeii, you've seen all of the basalt. So we used a kind of basalt just to cover the floor and keep it easy. Then there's this fellow. He has the worst legs in the universe. What we learned is that while everybody else, we could fix the legs. That took, there were like 24 people here, 24 legs here, right? We could get all the legs to work properly except for him. There's just nothing our computer guys could do to give him legs that worked. Then we figured out that we weren't the only ones, because looking at other Roman triumphal processions, they also screw up the legs. It's not uncommon. Remember, you're looking at this thing from down below, looking up. People didn't stop to check the legs. It wasn't meant to be studied in Duke University, right? It wasn't meant for art historians to give it that level of attention. It's a good example of our over-interest at some point. This guy's legs were not done well. And we can't figure out a way to make them be done well. Does that make sense? In other words, we have the feet, we have the leg. Something has to connect, because he can't be without legs. And no human being can stand like this, right? Other pieces that are worthy of note, notice the berries and the hats in the laurels, right? The bronze in the tririga up above, with probably Domitian standing in the middle. What do you do with this arch? How did we colorize it? There were other discoveries on the Palatine of architecture, and we simply covered what was done on other Flavian buildings in the Palatine. In other words, each element says something, but hardly anybody ever saw it this bright. Why is that? Because if you've come from where I come from, Southern California, and you paint your garage red, bright red, by fall it's going to be pink. Right? In other words, this is the day it was painted, not 6 months later. And so they would know to paint things brighter. You know, that great conversation about the Sistine Chapel? How the Sistine Chapel is way too bright? You don't think Michelangelo knew that it was going to get schmutzed up? All the smoke, all the fire, all the things that go on there. He made it brighter on purpose so that over time it would fade reasonably and not disappear. Right? And he was very successful. It took 400 years or something before they had to clean it seriously. This as well. This was made very bright, but do not be taken back. Now, there's something we didn't do. We all know what fine mummy portraits look like. We all know how painterly they can be. Pliny the Elder says Roman painters were deeply painterly. We didn't even attempt that yet. That's the next phase. We're going to give it to somebody who can actually paint and say, how far can we go with this? Knowing full well that we do not take ourselves seriously. In other words, nothing we're doing is right. It's just better than white. It was my initial experiment with doodle A through H that allowed us to begin to experiment here, Because our natural inclination was to say, we can't do that, we can't do that, we can't do that, oh, we did that, we can't do that, step by step, until we ended up with this thing, which looks nothing as it did in antiquity, but more than anybody has ever seen. And I think that's the important point. Now let's deal with some of the implications. If you were at the Arch of Titus, you would know that this image is on a east-west axis. In other words, it's slightly off east-west. That means that at night, especially in the winter, huge shadows come over this artifact. Okay? You know who figured this out, oddly enough? A fellow named Moses Gaster, when he visited it in 1900, and saw the people looking like they were moving, and they were designed to look like they were moving. Okay? Now, that effect caused by the stroping of light is multiplied when it's color. These guys look like a moving cartoon. In the 19th century, they used to go to sculpture like this, or the Laocoon, or some of the others, and actually use torches to make them look like night. They'd go to the Vatican Museum with a Laocoon with torches to make it look like it was moving. Right? They didn't have computers to do it. This object was supposed to look like it's moving. It's supposed to look like a procession going into the city of Rome, deeper and deeper and deeper into the stone. When you see it in black and white, however, all you see is the menorah and the people in static, without motion. So even if you go there today and watch the sun, you will see movement. But with the color, it was all that more impressive. This was designed to tell Romans how great they were and Jews how awful they were. Right? This was not a "we love Judaism" kind of statement. This was bringing these objects of the Jewish cult, essentially images of the divine, into Rome to be housed in the Temple of Peace, which is just down the road. And so literally up through the 2nd century, you could go into the Temple of Peace and see these objects on display. Now, one more thing I should point out. There are no texts preserved. All the texts that we put on, Sacra Judaicarum, Candelabrum Judaicarum, Leges Judaicarum, we put. This is based on Ida Oldenburg's work. We put it in Greek, in Latin, excuse me. We took it from the Greek of Josephus and translated it to Latin, because military in this sort of situation was going to use Latin. We actually took an old Latin translation and swiped it from there. We could have put Mensis Judaicarum, right, the table of the Jews, but who cares about a table? So we used it as an introductory panel. Candelabrum of the Jews, that's obvious, but what about the Jewish law? There is no Torah scroll here. This is a moving image, correct? The next thing in the parade, right where I am, is a guy holding a scroll. That's the assumption she makes that I think is right. In other words, that real sense of movement, and the signs navigate that sense of movement. Now, what I've tried to do then is begin with the theoretical, why this color thing is new. It shouldn't be. It's obvious to you and me and all of us who grew up with Walt Disney. It's obvious to museum curators. It was not obvious to people working in art history departments or in classics departments. It just wasn't anything anybody thought about. A new generation came on, began to think about it, museum people, and began to play. As often happens in the zeitgeist, I walked into that group through the eyes of a late antique poet who saw it too and served as a guide and let me start doodling and thinking and imagining. Next step, it took us into what is the importance of this color for dealing with Jewish-Roman relations, and the statue of Caligula became the tool for that, right? How do we deal with questions of relationship with Roman Empire when the statue is different than we thought? In other words, we all thought they were these nice white ghosts, right? They look like Jack LaLanne's health spa. No, these are colorful presences, and the texts tell us that, and we didn't believe them. And now we can see it where we couldn't see it before, right? Next, this focused in on this Arch of Titus project. And this Arch of Titus project allowed us to take one of the most important artifacts in the Western world and completely reimagine it. What did it look like? Now, do I know that it looked this way? I absolutely don't. But let me show you some of what we've been able to do with it. Is it close up? Good. Now, this is the video that we just created, which I'm not going to show you the whole thing because it's too much fun, for an exhibition at Yeshiva University Museum called The Art of Titus from Rome to Jerusalem and Back. I'm astonished to say that we put it up on Friday and we've had 50,000 hits on this video. I don't think anything in ancient history that wasn't related to a guy named Simcha had that many in a long time. Which is astonishing to me. But what we tried to do was explain how we took the scan, turned it into a 3D carved object, and then colorized it. And so I'm going to skip through the creation of it, and I'll just show parts of it just because it's fun. But I'm going to skip through like my students do when they watch television, right? All right, that's the fun part, right? But here's the thing coming off there. Let me go back. There's the thing coming off the truck in New York City, the artist making it, carving it, using the computer stuff to put it together. More carving. Bringing it to New York, the whole fuss about whether it fits through the doors or not. We keep going. Oops, there. Is that it? No. And then the installation, there it is. Let's go. Boom. That's the actual artifact, right? It's the artist, Lindsay Niehawk, who created the thing. It's an amazing process based upon the 3D scan, so it's about as close as you're going to get. Right? 900 pounds of plastic. She told me that it's called foam. There it is standing at the museum on display, but what's important is not that we have this white thing on display, but that we got to the next step, where the white thing is the exhibition. We are able to project onto it what we think are as close as we're going to get as the original colors, without 3D glasses, without headphones. If you go to Rome, you'll put these things on your head. Without anything but you looking at it, you will soon see the transitions. Right, there's the reconstruction and the colors. And slightly faded just for fun. Now, through all of this, my goal has been to introduce a new way of looking at ancient history, right? One that I didn't expect I would walk into, that I've now found myself in the middle of. It's going to turn into a book real soon called Colorful Rabbis, Polychromy in Judaism and Roman Antiquity. Because there's so much to say and so much to think about. You know, Jewish studies in the last 40 years got hung up on power issues, on the power of rabbis and the power of local communities, and can we trust or can we not trust, and stopped in many cases asking really interesting questions. Piyut was one of the ways that we broke that open, because here we had new sources, a whole library of them, that we could begin to ask questions about these people where those questions were not the questions. Archaeology was an essential way of breaking open that question. I think the polychromy thing is just another one in that path. Now, if it wasn't for people like Eric and Carol and Coleman and everyone else that I mentioned before, this would be completely impossible, because each step that we've done has moved forward, and it's because of that crazy group in North Carolina thinking things differently from almost anybody in the world and allowing each other to think differently than anybody in the world. That group that I've been a sort of honorary member of, that we can come to new paradigms and new ways of thinking about the material. And for this week, this is my new one. Thanks. Questions?